History has always loved kings and queens. But sometimes the most dangerous person in a royal court wasn't a general, wasn't a politician. It was a woman with a paintbrush. Her name was Élisabeth Vigée Le Brun. And here's the question: how does a young woman born in 18th century Paris, in a world where women were expected to stay silent, manage to become the most powerful portrait painter of a queen? Not just any queen, Marie Antoinette. A queen hated by the people. A queen whispered about in every street of France. A queen whose name would soon be tied to revolution, blood, and the fall of an empire. And yet, Elizabeth didn't just paint her once. She painted her again, and again, and again, until her portraits became the face of French royalty itself. But that creates another chilling question. Was Elizabeth simply an artist? Or was she secretly shaping how the world saw the queen? Because in an age where photography didn't exist, a portrait wasn't just art, it was power. It could soften hatred, create sympathy, or spark outrage. And sometimes it could put your life in danger. Because when the French Revolution erupted, Marie Antoinette wasn't the only one hunted. Elizabeth was forced to run. She left her home, her career, her safety, and disappeared into Europe, painting for emperors and nobles, trying to survive with nothing but her talent. So today, we're not just telling the story of a painter, we're asking something bigger. How could one woman rise so high in the most dangerous court in Europe and then escape when the entire world collapsed? Stay until the end, because her story proves something terrifying. Sometimes the difference between fame and death is just one painting. Fact 1. She started painting as a child. Before Élisabeth Vigée Le Brun ever painted queens, before her name entered royal palaces, she was just a child in Paris. But here's the mystery. How can a child, without money, without status, develop a talent strong enough to shock an entire society? Because Elizabeth didn't learn painting the normal way. She grew up inside it. Her father, Louis Vigée, was a portrait painter. So from the beginning, her world was filled with brushes, charcoal, frames, and faces. And while other children were playing, Elizabeth was watching how light touched a cheek, how shadows shaped the nose, how eyes could hide emotions. Then she started copying what she saw, not with toys, not with childish sketches, but with serious focus, like she already understood that art could become her future. Some accounts describe her drawing so often that people around her began to notice something unusual. Her lines had confidence. Her portraits had life. And that was rare. Because in the 18th century, especially for girls, art was not seen as a real path. Girls were expected to be quiet, to learn manners, not to build careers. But Elizabeth didn't follow rules. Even as a child, she had one powerful gift: obsession. She didn't just like painting, she couldn't stop painting. And the most shocking part? She improved incredibly fast. So fast that as a teenager, she began receiving real commissions, real clients, people paying her for portraits. Imagine that, a young girl in Paris, already earning money with her brush, in a world that didn't want women to succeed. That's why Fact 1 matters so much, because her childhood wasn't just the beginning, it was the proof. She wasn't lucky. She wasn't chosen by royalty. She was chosen by her own talent. And that talent would soon take her into the most dangerous place in France, the royal court. Fact 2. She was born in Paris in 1755. She was born in Paris in 1755, a city of candles, royal gossip, and hidden ambition. But here's the first question. How does a girl from a modest family become the painter of queens? Because Elizabeth wasn't born into luxury. She wasn't a princess. She wasn't protected by a noble name. Her father, Louis Vigée, was a talented portrait artist, a man who lived by the brush, not by a throne. And her mother, Jeanne Masson, worked as a hairdresser, a job that kept her close to fashion and society, but still far from real power. So imagine the atmosphere she grew up in, a home where art existed, but survival mattered just as much. And Elizabeth was different from the beginning. Even as a small child, she was obsessed with faces, the way emotions hide inside eyes, the way a smile can betray a secret. Some stories say she was drawing so early that her father looked at her sketches and realized this wasn't a hobby. This was destiny. Her childhood wasn't entirely free, though. For years, she was sent to a convent school where girls were raised to be quiet, obedient, and invisible. But Elizabeth didn't become invisible. She became sharper. And then, tragedy hit. When she was only 12 years old, her father died. And suddenly, everything changed. No mentor at home, no protector, just a young girl with a gift and a family trying to survive. So here's the real mystery. Most children would break, but Elizabeth turned pain into talent. And that's exactly where her legend begins. Fact 3. She became one of France's most famous female painters. In the 18th century, France admired art, but it didn't admire women who wanted power. So here's the real question. How did Élisabeth Vigée Le Brun become one of the most famous painters in France in a world that didn't want women to succeed? Because for women at that time, painting was acceptable only as a hobby. They could draw flowers, they could copy small portraits, but becoming a professional artist, competing with men, entering elite circles, that was almost impossible. Art academies were controlled by men, patrons were powerful men, and the entire system believed one thing. A woman's place was not in the spotlight, but Elizabeth was different. She didn't ask permission. She built her reputation the hardest way possible, through pure skill. People began talking about her portraits because they felt alive. Her subjects looked human, not frozen statues. Skin looked soft, eyes looked real. And suddenly Paris started whispering her name, not because she was a female painter, but because she was simply too good to ignore. Still, the obstacles didn't disappear. Every success she achieved created new enemies, men who feared competition, critics who disliked seeing a woman rise, people who believed she didn't deserve a place among masters. And yet, she kept going, portrait after portrait, client after client, until she reached something almost unthinkable. Elizabeth didn't just become famous, she became essential. In a society obsessed with image and status, her brush became a weapon. And by the time she entered royal circles, she was no longer just surviving, she was dominating. So fact 3 is not just about art, it's about defying an entire century. Because Elizabeth proved something powerful. Talent can break doors, even when society tries to lock them forever. Fact 4, the Queen's most famous portrait painter. Now here's where Élisabeth Vigée Le Brun's story becomes truly dangerous. Because she didn't just become a successful painter, she became the official face of a queen. And not just any queen, Marie Antoinette. So the question is, how does a young female artist earn the trust of the most watched, most criticized woman in France? At that time, Marie Antoinette was not simply royalty. She was a symbol of luxury, of scandal, of everything ordinary people hated about the court. And in a world without photography, a portrait wasn't decoration. A portrait was politics. It could shape public opinion, it could calm hatred, or ignite it. That's why Elizabeth's role was more than artistic. She was painting a message, again and again. Because Elizabeth didn't paint Marie Antoinette once. She painted her many times, creating the most famous images of the Queen that still exist today. Imagine the pressure. If the Queen looked cold, people would hate her more. If she looked too luxurious, people would rage. If she looked weak, the court would attack her. So Elizabeth had to create something almost impossible. A queen who looked powerful, but human. Royal, but approachable. And this is what made her unique. She didn't just paint faces, she painted reputation. And by doing that, Elizabeth didn't just enter the royal court, she became one of the most influential artists in France. But the closer you are to a queen, the closer you are to danger. Because when the revolution began, it wasn't only Marie Antoinette who became a target, it was everyone connected to her, including the woman who painted her into history. Fact 5, she married art dealer Jean-Baptiste Pierre Le Brun in 1776. In 1776, Élisabeth Vigée Le Brun made a decision that would change everything. She married Jean-Baptiste Pierre Le Brun, an art dealer, painter, and businessman deeply connected to the Paris art world. But here's the question. Was this marriage love or strategy? Because in 18th century France, marriage wasn't just personal. For a woman, especially an ambitious woman, marriage could decide her future. And Jean-Baptiste wasn't just a husband. He was a gatekeeper. An art dealer meant connections, wealthy clients, aristocratic circles, collectors, and exhibitions. So suddenly, Elizabeth wasn't only talented, she was visible, and visibility was power. This marriage helped open doors that were usually locked to women. More clients, more commissions, bigger names. But it wasn't a fairy tale. This is where Elizabeth's story becomes even more human. Because while her career rose, her personal life carried pressure. Some accounts suggest the marriage was difficult, and that her husband was more focused on money and business than her happiness. So think about it. She had fame growing. She had the royal court watching her. But at home, she still had to survive the expectations placed on women. And yet, she didn't slow down. She painted more than ever, building a reputation so strong that it eventually reached Marie Antoinette herself. So fact 6 is important because it shows the reality of her era. Elizabeth wasn't just fighting with brushes and talent. She was fighting through society, through rules, through marriage, and she still became one of the greatest portrait painters of France. Fact 6. She fled France in 1789 and lived in exile. When the French Revolution began, Élisabeth Vigée Le Brun's success became dangerous because she wasn't just a famous painter, she was closely connected to the monarchy, especially Marie Antoinette. And in 1789, that connection could get you arrested, or worse. So Elizabeth made a choice that saved her life. She left France in 1789, escaping the growing chaos and hatred in Paris. But exile wasn't a short journey. For years, she lived across Europe, painting portraits in places like Italy, Austria, and Russia, surviving with nothing but her talent. She lost her home, her comfort, and her safety, but she refused to lose her career. And that's why her story is so powerful. Even in exile, she remained unstoppable. Fact 7. She became famous across Europe during exile. Even in exile, Élisabeth Vigée Le Brun never stopped working. After fleeing France, she traveled across Europe and turned her survival into a new kind of fame. In Italy, she impressed elite circles with her refined portrait style. In Austria, she painted aristocrats who wanted the elegance of French art. And in Russia, she became admired by high society, gaining powerful patrons. Think about it. She had lost her country, but she didn't lose her talent. Wherever she went, nobles wanted one thing: to be painted by the woman who once painted a queen. So exile didn't destroy her career. It transformed her into an international legend. Fact 8. She created hundreds of works, 660 portraits, and 200 landscapes. When people talk about Élisabeth Vigée Le Brun, they often focus on one thing: Marie Antoinette. But here's what truly proves her greatness. Her sheer output was unbelievable. According to sources, she created around 660 portraits and about 200 landscapes, meaning she produced hundreds and hundreds of artworks across her lifetime. Now think about that for a moment. In the 18th century, there were no digital tools, no fast photography references, no modern materials. Everything was manual. Every portrait meant long hours of sketching, mixing pigments by hand, building layers of oil paint, correcting details, capturing expression, capturing status. And she wasn't painting simple faces either. She painted silk, pearls, velvet, lace, textures so realistic that her portraits almost felt alive. So the real question becomes, how did she produce so much while living through chaos, exile, and revolution? Because her life was not stable. She worked in Paris, then fled France, then painted in Italy, Austria, Russia, always moving, always adapting, always surviving. And yet she kept producing, portrait after portrait. Not only royalty, but nobility, wealthy patrons, and influential families all wanted to be painted by her. Why? Because to be painted by Vigée Le Brun wasn't just art. It was a symbol, a stamp of elegance, a reputation on canvas. That productivity wasn't accidental. It revealed her discipline, her speed, her mastery, and most importantly, her refusal to disappear, even when history tried to erase her. So fact 8 proves something powerful. Elizabeth didn't just create beautiful paintings, she built an entire empire with a brush. Fact 9. She wrote a memoir, Souvenirs. Published in the 1830s, most artists leave behind paintings, but Élisabeth Vigée Le Brun left behind something even rarer, her own voice. Because later in life, she wrote her memoirs, a personal book known as Souvenirs, published in the 1830s. And this isn't just a diary, it's a historical treasure. Here's the real question. Why would a woman who already painted queens feel the need to write her life story? Because Elizabeth knew something most people forget. Paintings can be admired, but stories can be erased. She lived in one of the most dangerous eras in European history. She witnessed the glittering height of Versailles and then watched it collapse into fear, revolution, and blood. She saw how quickly public opinion can change. One day you are celebrated. The next day, you are hunted. And she understood that after the revolution, many people would rewrite the past, especially the past connected to Marie Antoinette. So her memoirs became more than just memories. They became a way to defend her truth. In Souvenirs, she reflects on her childhood, her rise as a painter, her relationship with powerful patrons, and the terrifying moment she had to flee France in 1789. And what makes this book so important is that it is personal. History books often speak in numbers and events, but memoirs reveal fear, ambition, jealousy, secret conversations inside royal rooms, the tension in court, the way artists were treated, the way women were judged. And Elizabeth was not writing as a distant observer. She was writing as someone who stood inside the palace and survived. Think about it. Most people know Marie Antoinette through rumors, through propaganda, through hatred. But Elizabeth saw the queen in private, not as a symbol, but as a person. And even if readers don't agree with her views, her memoir gives us something priceless, a first-hand window into the emotional reality of the royal court. That's why modern historians still return to her memoirs today, because the brush shows what someone looked like, but the memoir shows what the world felt like. It shows how fragile fame truly is and how powerful survival can be. And there's something deeply poetic about it. A woman who spent her life painting faces for history finally decided to paint her own story with words. So fact 9 isn't just a fun detail. It proves that Elizabeth wasn't only an artist. She was also a witness. And without Souvenirs, a huge part of her world would have vanished forever. Fact 10. Her death and legacy. Élisabeth Vigée Le Brun didn't die young. She didn't vanish in tragedy like many artists. Instead, she lived long enough to watch the world change completely. She was born in 1755, in the age of kings and palaces, but she died in 1842 in a France that had already been reshaped by revolution, fear, and new power. Think about that. She witnessed the glory of Versailles, the fall of Marie Antoinette, the collapse of the royal court, and the rise of an entirely new era. By the time she reached old age, she was no longer a court painter running from danger. She was a living legend. In her final years, she returned to France, still respected, still remembered. And when she died in Paris in 1842, it wasn't just the death of an artist. It was the end of a witness, a woman who had stood close to a queen and survived a revolution, a woman who painted faces that still define history. But here's the most powerful part. Even after her death, her work didn't disappear. Her portraits remain some of the clearest images of European royalty, not just how they looked, but how they wanted to be remembered. So fact 10 is not only about her death, it's about what she left behind. Hundreds of paintings, a memoir, and proof that talent can break the rules of an entire century. Because in the end, she didn't just paint queens, she became immortal in history herself.